Late Thursday night, July 23rd, Cardi B opened Instagram Live after a dinner out with friends, and somewhere in that conversation, the topic turned to sons, dating, and what happens when a house rule gets broken in the worst possible way. She wasn't doing press. There was no publicist standing off camera feeding her talking points. It was just her, phone propped up, talking the way people talk after a few hours out with friends, when a subject comes up naturally and nobody's filtering anything. She said the dinner table conversation had landed on a question a lot of parents avoid answering out loud. What happens if your son brings a girl home and things go further than they should? Cardi didn't hesitate with her answer. She said she's not the type of mother who bans girls from the house altogether. Her sons can have company over. The doors can't be fucking closed, she said, and she followed that up with an observation a lot of parents privately agree with but rarely say on camera. Boys, in her experience, are harder to control than girls. They're going to do what they want to do regardless of what their mother tells them. So instead of trying to control the outcome entirely, her rule focuses on limiting the opportunity. Doors open. That's the boundary, not a ban, a limit. Then came the part of the clip that actually went viral. The rule everyone's been repeating since. If one of her sons ever comes to her and says he got a girl pregnant, that's the day he moves out of her house. Not eventually. Not after a family meeting about next steps. Her exact wording was that it wouldn't be because I'm mean, but because getting a girl pregnant is, in her framing, a decision that instantly ends boyhood. The moment that happens, in her words, you have to become a man, and being a man in her house means the financial support stops immediately. No mother's money, no father's money, no mother's roof either. She repeated that phrase almost like a rule she'd already thought through long before this live. She didn't leave the rule as a vague threat with no structure behind it. She actually laid out a full financial plan for her children, the kind most parents describe in theory during a serious conversation but almost never spell out this specifically, especially not on camera. Once her kids reach their teenage years, they get an allowance. Once they turn 18, if they choose to move out of the house, she'll help cover their rent, but only under one condition. They have to either be enrolled, done in school, or actively building a business. That's the entire deal. Ambition and effort get financially backed. A pregnancy before either of those milestones is met cancels the whole arrangement immediately, with no exceptions and no negotiation period. Her reasoning for that hard cutoff was blunt, and she explained it plainly rather than leaving it implied. She said if she let her sons stay comfortable after making that kind of decision, they would keep making it over and over again because there would be no real cost attached to it. Comfort, in her view, removes consequence. Take the comfort away and suddenly the decision carries weight it wouldn't otherwise have. It's a fairly direct behavioral argument. Remove the safety net, and the behavior that depends on that safety net existing becomes far less likely. Clips spread fast across entertainment pages and social platforms within a day, and the reactions split almost evenly down the middle, with very little middle ground between the two camps. One camp lined up fully behind her. The phrase tough love showed up constantly across comment sections and reaction videos. People pointed out that she isn't punishing her sons for dating or for having girls over or for having a relationship at all. She's drawing a hard line specifically around unprotected sex, resulting in an unplanned pregnancy. And several commenters argued that a teenage boy who knows the exact cost of that outcome in advance might genuinely think twice before it happens. More than one comment framed her rule as a deterrent rather than a punishment, the argument being that if the safety net disappears the instant a mistake is made, the mistake itself becomes far less appealing to risk in the first place. Some also brought up the young woman on the other side of that hypothetical situation, pointing out that a young man raised knowing the real financial and domestic stakes of careless sex might be more inclined to use protection or have an honest conversation with a partner before anything happens rather than after. The other camp pushed back just as hard, and their argument wasn't dismissed easily either. Their position, A scared teenager who just found out he's about to be a father needs support that day more than any other day of his life. And pulling the floor out from under him at that exact moment doesn't build a man. It just leaves a kid with nowhere to go at the worst possible time. One comment responding to the story summed up the counter-argument directly. Actions have consequences, sure, but kicking him out immediately could push him further into trouble rather than teach him anything real about responsibility. Others raised a related point that removing a young father's stability right, as he's trying to process the biggest decision of his life so far, might make him less likely to stay involved, not more, since he'd have every incentive to disappear from the situation entirely rather than face it under pressure. Neither side is arguing from nowhere, and neither is obviously wrong. One side is arguing that consequences shape behavior, and that removing comfort forces maturity to develop faster than it otherwise would. The other side is arguing that removing comfort at the exact moment a person is most vulnerable doesn't build maturity at all. It just removes the very support system that maturity usually needs in order to grow. Both of these positions have been debated inside parenting circles for decades, long before this Instagram Live ever existed. What Cardi's clip did was give that decades-old argument a specific, public, very recognizable face, and that's a large part of why it spread as fast as it did. People weren't just reacting to a celebrity opinion. They were reacting to a version of an argument they've likely had inside their own families at some point. There's a timing detail worth sitting with here too, since it changes how the statement reads. Cardi is currently pregnant with her fourth child, her first with her boyfriend, NFL player Stefon Diggs. She's already raising 3 children from her prior relationship with Offset, so the rules she laid out for her sons isn't coming from someone theorizing about parenting from a comfortable distance. It's coming from someone actively managing a large, blended family in real time, in public, under a level of scrutiny most parents never have to deal with while making these same decisions privately. There's a second detail worth placing next to this one, because it adds context to where this rule is actually coming from. In a separate recent appearance, on a podcast interview, Cardi talked about wanting her children to end up as a far better version of herself, more disciplined, more capable, able to do things she says she cannot do herself. She was careful in that interview to clarify she doesn't want her kids to be perfect, just better than she was. She said whatever she instills in them now, even the parts of it they resent in the moment, is something she expects them to eventually understand and appreciate later in life, even if it comes with tears or frustration along the way. Put those two moments side by side, and a pattern starts to show up that wasn't obvious from the pregnancy clip alone. The rule isn't really rooted in anger toward a hypothetical future mistake. It reads more like an extension of the exact philosophy she described on that podcast. Discipline enforced now, even when it's unpopular or uncomfortable, in exchange for a stronger outcome later. Whether removing a teenage son's housing the same day he becomes a father actually produces that stronger outcome, or whether it backfires into exactly the kind of instability the second camp is worried about, isn't something either side of this argument can actually prove ahead of time. It's a bet Cardi is making based on her own parenting philosophy, built from her own experience of being pushed into adult responsibility fast. And the internet right now is genuinely split on whether it's the right bet to make. What is certain, regardless of which side turns out to be right, is that her sons now know, in explicit and specific terms, exactly what's expected of them, and exactly what happens the moment that line gets crossed. There's no ambiguity left in the rule, no room to claim later that the boundary wasn't clear, whether that level of clarity produces responsible, accountable young men down the line, or whether it simply removes support at the worst possible moment in a young person's life, isn't something that will be answerable for years, if it's ever fully answerable at all. For now, what exists is one Instagram Live clip, filmed on a random Thursday night after dinner with friends, that turned into one of the more heavily debated parenting statements of the year. It was built entirely around a rule that a lot of parents privately think through at some point, but almost never say out loud with this much specific, financial, no exceptions detail attached to it. It's also worth being precise about who exactly this rule applies to, because Cardi's family is bigger and more complicated than a single soundbite usually captures. She's currently a mother of 3, her daughter Culture, her son Waveset, and her daughter Blossom Bell, all from her relationship with Offset before the couple's public split. Her 4th child, the one she's currently carrying with Stefan Diggs, hasn't been born yet. So when this rule went viral, it technically applies right now to one son, Wave, who is still a toddler, years away from any of this being a live issue in his own life. That detail matters, because it reframes the clip. This wasn't a reaction to a real situation happening in her house. It was a preemptive stance, laid out years in advance, almost like she wanted the expectation on record, long before it could ever become relevant. That preemptive framing changes how some viewers interpreted the clip once it spread. A portion of the reaction wasn't about whether the rule itself was fair, it was about the fact that she was thinking this far ahead at all. Several comments picked up on the idea that most parents don't sit down and pre-plan a FIA consequence structure for a toddler's hypothetical teenage decisions, and that doing so, whether people agreed with the content of the rule or not, reflected a level of intentional planning that stood out from how these conversations usually surface, which is almost always reactive, after something has already gone wrong. The financial structure she described also drew its own separate thread of commentary, somewhat apart from the pregnancy rule itself. The idea of an allowance during the teenage years, followed by conditional rent support after 18, tied specifically to either school enrollment or starting a business, was treated by a chunk of commenters as a broader statement about how she views adulthood generally, not just fatherhood. In that reading, the pregnancy clause isn't really a standalone rule about sex or contraception at all. It's one specific trigger inside a much larger philosophy she's built around what earns continued support and what doesn't, getting a girl pregnant before hitting either of those 2 milestones.